Yes. And now the first thing it sees is a big close-up of my face. All right. Thank you all.
Okay. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to have our three presenters do their papers, and then we're going to have a brief question and answer session. And we will definitely wrap up in plenty of time for us all to go downstairs to the awards ceremony, which you are all invited to. We are giving out awards, and more importantly, there will be food. So at this time of year, no one should be giving out free food. I'm Professor Rachel Anderson. I'm in the English Lit area, but I like everything. And I also teach capstone a lot, so I get interested in absolutely everything.
And I'm Professor Pearson. I'm one of the linguists, and I was interested in this session because my bachelor's is actually in music therapy, so it was like, some of you are doing music stuff, so really delighted to be here and looking forward to it.
Is there one going around?
It's not recognizing my little guy, so hold on. Good thing I emailed it to myself.
Just sort of what I tell my students all the time. How about that?
I don't know, it's kind of like that.
It's actually fun.
It's good like that?
Yes.
It's just on the computer that it's coming up like that. Okay. Good.
Yeah, it'll look weird on the computer because it's that format.
Gotcha.
So.
Good to know. All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Emmie Carr, and my thesis is called Fighting the Power from Within the Power, using hip-hop-based education as a mode of critical pedagogy. Okay. So a pedagogy is a method and practice of teaching, and this pedagogy revolves completely around the culture of hip-hop and the genre of music that is found within that culture. So to begin, I want to provide a little insight about the culture of hip-hop, which ultimately led to hip-hop-based education, or HHBE. So although the culture wasn't clearly established until 1973, the origins of hip-hop could be seen 2 decades prior in 1953, because this was the year that a man named Robert Moses began construction on the Cross Bronx Expressway. I don't know why this isn't working. So, as you can see from the pictures, the Cross Bronx Expressway quite literally cut down the middle of this borough in New York City, so it displaced nearly 60,000 residents. These are actually apartment buildings, and many more apartment buildings had to be torn down to make room for this development. So, out of the 60,000 residents, many of the middle class or upper class residents were able to move to the newer neighborhoods that were popping up alongside of this new highway. But a lot of the lower class residents, which were primarily African Americans and Puerto Ricans, did not have the funds or the opportunity to make this move, so they were caught up in the crosshairs of this development. And eventually they were kind of forced to reestablish themselves in newly built housing projects that Robert Moses also created in anticipation of this problem. Yeah. So, hip-hop was created to be a form of resistance to the structures and people that quite literally relocated these communities to the margins of our society. And while hip-hop quickly caught on as a culture of letting loose and having fun and connecting to your peers, it's also always been about taking responsibility and remaining critical and perceptive to the society that you live in. So it only makes sense that a pedagogy that speaks to this culture also speaks to these issues. So HHBE engages and intermixes the structure of their learning environment with the cultural ethos of hip-hop that I just detailed. It naturally became a pedagogy as the culture continued to develop because of its connection to the knowledge of self and of community, which is one of the 5 elements. So when they say knowledge of self and knowledge of community, they really mean having the ability to reflect and within yourself and outside yourself. So this requires a lot of insight and deep thinking. So the belief of knowledge in this community is that there's no true definition because everybody utilizes and displays it differently. So as cliche as it sounds, knowledge is truly in the eye of the beholder. So this line of thought is central to an HHBE classroom, but it also speaks to a really common educational theory called funds of knowledge, which are defined as the various intelligences each student brings from their cultural, communal, and familial backgrounds before ever stepping foot into a classroom. So the potential of HHBE is vast in how it finds creative ways to build off of more traditional pedagogies and educational theories to provide a total reimagining of the classroom experience. It speaks to the cultural, everyday intelligences of its students, and in this way, HHBE encapsulates and builds off of Paulo Freire's notion of a critical pedagogy. So Paulo Freire, as a Brazilian educational theorist that I made a lot of my thesis argument around, he wrote the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which details a teaching approach that attempts to help students question and challenge societal practices that work to further marginalize and disenfranchise certain members of our community. So as a mode of critical education, HHBE encourages students to develop a critical lens of viewing community and self. So as Freire puts it, they're eventually able to envision a social order which supports their full humanity. It embraces the idea that the hip-hop culture provides context for students to develop critical consciousness and awareness, engage in activism, and become more motivated for academic skill development. So Freire argues that to uproot and undo the oppression that society has inflicted on many of its members, we have to revamp the whole system. And education is both the core and the springboard of this system. So everything starts in the classroom, and every good thing comes out of a sound education. So we as educators cannot continue to solely rely on things like multicultural literature to combat the marginalization of student identities. And while this is a really sound and awesome practice, only implementing this to reach these means is an example of false charity. We can and should do more. True generosity lies in the actions of the teacher that focuses on creating autonomy for their students. This is developed by a curriculum centered around student interest, identity, and intelligences, and this is what HHBE does. So curriculums such as this work to create critical consciousness and awareness in its students, and Freire defines this as the ability to reflect on the world in hopes of eventually changing it. So this reflection leads to a lot of critical discourse and dialogue and debates within the classroom, so many HHBE lessons revolve around these practices. It's all about talking to your peers, reflecting with each other, and also coming back to reflect within yourself. So to show that HHBE is more than just a theory, it's also a practice, I have pulled forth a few lesson plans that I found within my research. So this first one is by HHBE scholar Crystal Bell. But first I want to point out that this pedagogy is extremely flexible. So it can be used as a main course of instruction or as a supplement to more traditional instruction. So it's flexible in the ways that it can be integrated into the classroom. So Crystal Bell, the HHB scholar, detailed a lesson plan that utilizes Jay-Z's song Where I'm From, which is considered an autobiographical narrative because it explains and explores the artist's environments that he grew up in and how this environment impacted his identity. So through the analyzation of these lyrics, students were able to explore various cultural and communal concepts that were relevant to their classroom community because it's actually the same community that Jay-Z was detailing the song. So this type of connection will further create student autonomy and interest because these are themes and topics that are relevant to them in their lives. So as you may notice, this is the first line of the song, and this alone is enough to have a full thematic investigation because it's talking about gun violence and how the media isn't super interested in detailing the strifes of these types of communities. So just looking at the first line alone, you can really see how much critical discourse and dialogue and reflection could come out of such a lesson plan. So a lesson such as this asks students not only to read the words of the song, but to read the surrounding world and society that made Jay-Z want to write these words. It asks you to look outside yourself to evaluate, like, where am I in my culture? How does my identity reflect from that, and how am I impacted by it? By repositioning hip-hop text as literary nonfiction, educators can inspire students to look beyond standard classroom language and instruction to evaluate socially relevant literature and themes. And this lesson plan speaks exactly to Frere's notion in critical pedagogies, and that is all about dissecting places and roles in society. And it often requires a lot of heavy conversations. And so a lot of teachers may not be into that. They don't want to walk into the classroom every day saying, oh, I'm going to have to talk about race relations with my fifth graders. Like, that's not a thing that everyone wants to do all the time. So to show how versatile HHB HHBE is, there's another lesson plan. And this one is by another HHB educator. His name is Michael Dando. And he integrated this pedagogy into his classroom by using rap songs as a way to analyze beat structure, tempo, and meter, and all the other fun poetic elements. So through a process he called beat mapping, students were able to choose a song to find rhythmic patterns, analyze stanza and meter, and they asked each other questions that are usually reserved for more canonical poetry, like how does meter affect this stanza? Or what is the effect of emphasizing a certain word over the other? So these are questions that are usually reserved for more traditional texts in the classroom, but it just shows that you can easily bridge into those texts by more accessible and relevant literature. But beat mapping isn't always about poetry, and neither is hip-hop songs. It's much more than just poetry. So this lesson also included flowcharts that allowed exploration of words in a particular song and how the artists used them, as well as where, when, and how. So this is a common literary practice that teachers use in all types of investigations. So it's just hip-hop songs are a lot more than just poetry. It can bridge into analyzing storytelling, because many hip-hop songs are stories, or first-person narratives and all that fun stuff. So they can provide a supplement to more traditional texts or be standalone content. So lessons such as this one shows that hip-hop provides not only valuable insight on society and culture, but also on the formation and creation of literature. Hip-hop text provides standalone content that can work in lieu of or as a supplement to more traditional texts. But using more socially relevant texts, such as a Notorious B.I.G. song, helps students develop autonomy by seeing their culture and interests reflected in the curriculum. And this is central to any critical pedagogy. So even though this lesson doesn't require some of the heavy-hitting concepts and questions as the other one did, it still draws back to a critical pedagogy. Because at its core, it's based around the culture of hip-hop, which grew out of a state of resistance and resilience. So pedagogy is always going to discuss these things. And you can see that because even this song has a little bit of insight of community and self. So it's always going to draw back to those critical pedagogies. So to wrap it up, I would like to say that the future of our society lies in the hands of a critical pedagogy such as HHBE. Both Paulo Freire and I firmly believe that educators are revolutionary leaders, and as such, it is our responsibility to prepare our students to become the most active and critical citizens that they can be. In order to realistically fight the power, we must first know and recognize our own power as revolutionary leaders, and we must advocate for our students and put their beliefs and interests first. HHBE allows youth to create their own knowledge and realize that their funds of understanding and lived realities are valued. By placing students' strengths and interests at the center of the curriculum, HHBE is a pedagogy that is engaging, democratic, and transformative. It relegates the marginalized and often distorted voice to the front and center of education. This is a pedagogy of humankind, and this is a pedagogy that is working to transform society. As famous jazz poet Gil Scott-Heron once said, "This revolution will not be televised." And he was right, because this revolution takes place in the classroom. Thank you.